World War II, Part 2. And this time, it's personal. World War II, the biggest war in world history. Was it a war when you took the test? Did you win the war? Maybe you didn't. Now it's time for round 2. Don't get mad, get glad. Because you have another opportunity for greatness. What you will do is take out your remediation guide. It's got all those blanks in it. And you are going to follow along on this video. And any words that are read or words that you need to write on those blanks, and when you are finished, you will have created the most premium study guide. You will study the study guide. You will also make note cards from it. Study those note cards and get ready to rock and roll on World War II Part 2. That would be the retest that you're going to take. So let's get rolling. Let's dig into this World War II topic. Now, the war begins in Europe and Asia. If you are in Europe, if you are in Asia, you are experiencing war. But if you are in the United States of America, are you experiencing war? No. Number one, during the first 2 years of war, the United States remained neutral. Write that N-E-U-T-R-A-L, as Germany overran France and most of Europe, as well as pounded Great Britain through the air. That would be the Battle of Britain. So at first, the United States does not want to get involved. But we do start to help countries at war. Specifically, we help Great Britain. Despite a strong isolationist sentiment at home, that means stay home, don't get involved in European stuff, the U.S. increasingly helped, and I know it's hard to see because my face is blocking, Great Britain. The United States increasingly began to help Great Britain, especially during the Battle of Britain. That is when Hitler looked to take over Great Britain. So, what did the United States do to try to help Great Britain and the other allied countries? Well, the first thing was the Lend-Lease Act. Please write in Lend-Lease Act. This is the Borrowing Act. Gave the president the authority to sell or lend equipment to countries fighting the Axis powers. This would be Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now has the authority to lend old war equipment to countries fighting the Axis powers. But was it enough? I mean, if you're going up against Adolf Hitler, one of the crazy people in American history, or in world history, who's built up one of the most intense military giants ever seen, is that going to be enough to take down Hitler? Well, of course the answer is no. President Franklin Roosevelt, we're also on number 3 here, said the Lend-Lease Act was like lending a garden hose to a next-door neighbor whose house is on fire. Please write hose and fire, meaning not close to being enough to helping beat Adolf Hitler. Okay, let's talk about what's happening in Asia for a second. The United States refused to recognize Japanese conquest in Manchuria in Asia. Japan had invaded the land that is Manchuria, brutalized the people, and taken over so that they could get oil and steel. The United States was not happy with this, so what did the United States do? Imposed an embargo, please write in embargo, on oil and steel to Japan. Japan, if you want to take away other people's oil and steel, if that's what you're after, you will not get it from the United States of America. That is what was done to Japan. Japan was not happy with this at all, so Japan attacked. While negotiating and without warning, Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. Take it away, FDR.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
That was the date. Write that in. Write that in. President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. FDR, take it away again.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy.
The United States is now officially at war. because he asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which they did. Now, the United States is involved. The debates over isolationism are officially over. Write this in, long one. Please put in World War II was now a true world war. Why was it a true world war? Because the United States was fully involved. You got Russia, you got Great Britain, you got Hitler, you've got Japan, you've got the United States of America involved in this incredibly immense conflict. Alright, another topic. Let's talk a little bit about minority participation in World War II. You know, African Americans mostly served in segregated non-combat roles. Most African Americans did not find themselves fighting, instead maybe working in the kitchen in non-combat roles. But please write this in. They demanded the right to serve in combat. They demanded the right to serve in combat. One example of African Americans serving in a combat role were the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of all African American fighter pilot unit, and they served with distinction in Europe, served incredibly well, protecting big bombers and clearing the way railroads from trains supplying the Nazi army. Tuskegee Airmen. Hey, what about Japanese Americans? Now, we've talked about that the Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps on the West Coast, but there still were all Asian fighting units. Nisei, N-I-S-E-I, Nisei regiments, Asian Americans, earned a number of decorations fighting in World War II. They were highly decorated. Mexican Americans served in non-segregated units, so they were in integrated units if you were a Mexican American, but Nisei Asian Americans were segregated and they earned a high number of decorations. Navajo communication codes were used in the Pacific. Now just think about this. If you want to communicate and say you want to call in a bombing raid at Alpha 43, Bravo, Delta 26, well, if Japan can understand all of that, then they can make moves to make sure that that doesn't have a bad impact on them. But you won't say that in English. You'll say that in Navajo. Navajo Indians used their language to communicate coordinates and other information for the United States in the war effort in the Pacific. This oral, not written language was, write this in, impossible. It was impossible for the Japanese to break. It could not be broken. Those are the contributions of the Navajo Indians in World War II. You know, while this war is happening, you're having African Americans leave the South, go north. That's great migration stuff. We've learned about that before. African Americans migrated to cities in search of jobs. African Americans also campaigned for victory in the war and equality at home. This was called the WWII campaign. Let's win victory in World War II and win victory over Jim Crow laws in the United States of America. War on the home front. This means not talking about the battlefields in Europe or in Asia, but right here in the United States of America. What did the United States do to try to win the war at home? Well, you need soldiers. The draft, that would be the selection of service, was conducted selection of people in the Army was conducted by the Selective Service, was used to provide personnel for the military. So we have the Selective Service. That's where you get the draft from. Let's go to 13. Are you ready for a killer combination? The combination of government and industry forged a close working relationship. Government would go to industry, let's say Ford, car maker, and say, Ford, I don't need you to make cars anymore. I need you to make tanks. Ford makes tanks, and what does that do? It allocates resources for the war effort. Businesses retooled to wartime production to allocate resources effectively, and that is exactly what they did. Rationing was used to maintain, write this in, a long one, a supply of essential products to the war effort. A supply of essential products to the war effort. That is rationing. Rationing as in, folks, reducing their consumption of things like rubber, like eggs, like oil, like cotton. All that stuff would be going to the war effort. Now, how do you raise money for this incredible war? War bonds and income taxes were used to finance the war effort. War bonds are IOUs from the government to the American people that instantly raised money. And then the income tax was higher. People's incomes were taxed at a more expensive rate, meaning more money was generated for the war effort. The U.S. maintained strict censorship of war reporting. If you were a war reporter, you could not say whatever you want. This was to keep spies from getting information about the location of United States military. Public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war effort. The constant focus of Americans was to keep track of how the United States is doing in the war and what Americans can do to try to help the war effort. The entertainment industry produced movies, plays, and shows that, write this in, boosted morale and patriotic support for the war effort and portrayed the enemy in stereotypical ways. What we have here pictured is the movie The Great Dictator, starring Charlie Chaplin, who is portrayed as Adolf Hitler, or somebody inspired by Adolf Hitler, in this film. And it was designed to boost morale and patriotic support for the war effort. Women increasingly participated in the workforce to replace men serving in the military. Now, there wasn't a specific name for like one real person, but the person that was made to idolize all of these women was Rosie the Riveter. The example given is, write this in, Rosie the Riveter. New topic, new topic, new topic. Let's talk about Japanese Americans on the home front. Let's start with a very sad fact. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were relocated to internment camps. They were held in internment camps, stripped of their homes, stripped of their rights, for two reasons. Number 19, here we go. First reason, strong anti-Japanese prejudice. Please write in prejudice on the West Coast. This had been in place for decades. There had been a strong anti-Asian prejudice as seen in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. You still have that racism present. That's one. Here's two. Secondly, the false belief that the Japanese were, and I'm blocking this one, so let me read it to you, were aiding the enemy. Please write, were aiding the enemy. Meaning the false belief that there was treason. The false belief that these Japanese Americans were helping the Empire of Japan. Got that? Good, great, awesome. The Japanese Americans tried to sue to end the internment camps, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, please write in Supreme Court, upheld the internment. They continued the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, eventually, the United States government would apologize and make payment to the survivors of this dark chapter of World War II American history. Let's talk about the military history of the World War II. Let's jump into the battles, baby! In Europe, number 21, America followed a right in this defeat Hitler first strategy. Defeat Hitler first, which means most resources would be targeted to taking care of Adolf Hitler in Europe, and then afterwards looking at winning the war in the Pacific. Now, in the Pacific, the U.S. started an island hopping. Please write in island hopping campaign. You want to get close to Japan, but first you got to take over all the islands that are close to Japan. So it's to seize island closer and closer to Japan in order to, one, use as bases to attack Japan, and two, cut off Japanese supplies using naval warfare. So those are the strategies. But what really happened following Pearl Harbor? Japan captured the U.S.-held Philippines. Almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded and took over the U.S.-held Philippines. Now the troops, the U.S. troops that remained, were put on the Bataan Death March. Please write in Bataan Death March. It is when American prisoners of war suffered brutal treatment by the Japanese. They were beaten. They were starved. They were deprived of water. thousands of Americans died on the Bataan Death March, which shows how savage the fighting was in the Pacific. Speaking of that, prisoners of war treatment in the Pacific reflected the savagery of the fighting there. You know what's a great example of that? Japanese soldiers would often commit, please write this in, suicide rather than surrender. That shows how tough the fighting in the Pacific was. What was the goal of the Japanese? What was their military war strategy? Number 25. Japanese leaders hoped that America would accept Japanese predominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So what we're talking about is Japan wants to take over the Philippines, bomb Pearl Harbor, exert their power so the U.S. will be so intimidated, will have no desire to go in and fight Japan, rather than fighting a costly war to reverse Japanese gains. That's the idea and the goals of the Empire of Japan. Let's talk real battles. Number 26. Number 26. In North Africa, Hitler lost at the Battle of El Alamein. El Alamein in North Africa was a loser for Hitler. So what does that mean? It prevented Adolf Hitler from taking over Middle Eastern oil and denied an attack of the Soviet Union from the south. Adolf Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union and now had no ability to get there south and could not get Middle Eastern oil. You need oil to run a gigantic military, and Hitler can't get it because of his loss at El Alamein. Ready for another Hitler loss? Let's go. 27. In Europe, at the Battle of Stalingrad, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were captured and killed at the Battle of Stalingrad. Total casualty numbers were close to 1 million. Your life expectancy if you were a Russian troop was about 1 hour. Hitler was denied Soviet oil, and the battle turned the tide against Germany in the east. So now Hitler is unable to invade the Soviet Union and is unable to get any oil from the Soviet Union because of the Battle of Stalingrad. Notice, the United States has not been involved in these conflicts. Here we go. Here comes the United States. In Europe, Normandy in France, D-Day, were the landings led by, please write this in, future President Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower's landings in Europe succeeded and landed in German-occupied France. Got to know this date. June 6, 1944. On June 6, 1944 was D-Day. The landing succeeded, and please write this in, the liberation of Western Europe from Hitler had begun. This is a turning point, which means we get to listen to epic turning point music. Hitler is on the run because of D-Day, but that's just Hitler. What about in the Pacific? The turning point in the Pacific was the Battle of Midway, also called, please write this in, the Miracle of Midway. There were many more Japanese ships and planes, but still the United States was able to win control of the Midway. U.S. defeated a much larger Japanese force. Japanese victory would have allowed Japan to invade Hawaii, but they didn't get it, which means it was a turning point, which means we get to listen to epic turning point music. We got Midway. Please write this in. U.S. victory at Midway ended the Japanese threat to Hawaii and began island hopping. Ended the Japanese threat to Hawaii and began island hopping, carrying the war closer and closer to Japan. Please write in Japan, the last part of number 30, the last part of number 30. Now, things got very, very, very close to Japan, to the point where the only thing left to do is to invade Japan. But if you invade Japan, the number of casualties will be so high that, can you really do it? Is there another way? Before we do that, U.S. invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, brought American forces closer and closer to Japan. Please write Iwo Jima and Okinawa. This shows how hard it would ever be to invade Japan, because Japanese soldiers, please write this in, fought fiercely. They fought fiercely over every square inch of the islands. Japanese soldiers fought fiercely over every square inch of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Cool? Facing the prospect of horrendous casualties from invading Japan, President Harry Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the terrible thing about the bomb was that tens of thousands were killed. Shortly after, Japan surrendered, avoiding the need for the U.S. to invade Japan. The last thing you're going to say here is avoiding the need for the U.S. to invade Japan, avoiding the need for the United States to invade Japan. That is why the atomic bombs were dropped. Terrible that they killed thousands, but that was the military goal of dropping the atomic bombs. So the war is over, but what is this world going to look like after World War II? Let's talk briefly about post-World War II outcomes. Number 33. In the Nuremberg trials, please write Nuremberg. Nazi leaders were convicted of war crimes, the Holocaust. This is where Nazi leaders who were in charge of the Holocaust were put on trial for it. Now, you can't get Adolf Hitler on trial. He had killed himself. But those who were left were put on trial. They said, I'm not guilty because I was just following orders. The Nuremberg trial said, not good enough. It emphasized, please write this in, individual responsibility. Please write individual responsibility for actions during war, regardless of orders received. What does Europe look like? What does the map of Europe look like? After World War II, the Soviets controlled Eastern Europe and East Germany under communist rule. So you have communists in Eastern Europe, East Germany is communist. In Western Europe and West Germany resumed democratic self-government. So we've got a split in Europe. That split will become the Iron Curtain, which will have the attention of the world for about 50 years. 35. Japan adopted a democratic government and resumed self-government and allied with the United States, which, if you think about it, is kind of cray-cray that Japan, who received not one but 2 nuclear attacks from the United States, would end up being an ally of the United States. But indeed, they were. Now, you've got Western Europe that has been ruined by war. How do you prevent communism from taking over? Well, one way is to drop dollar bills. Y'all, that was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, the U.S. provided financial aid to rebuild European economies and prevent the spread of communism. A way to remember this is Marshall Money, MMM. Something else was created after World War II, and that is the United Nations. Now, what is the purpose of the United Nations? It is to create a body of nations of the world to, please write this in, try to prevent future global wars. This is the goal of Woodrow Wilson, with more power in the form of the United Nations, to try to prevent future global wars. Got it? Great. Geneva Convention attempted to ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war. In Switzerland, in a city called Geneva, they've been meeting for years to come up with rules on how to treat prisoners of war. Well, a lot of this is the reaction to the Bataan Death March that the Geneva Convention really takes off after World War II in advocating for the rights of prisoners of war. Speaking of war, how sad is it that after World War II, another war started like that? And that was the Cold War. Let's talk about origins of the Cold War. Number 1, The Cold War is going to last from the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. That is decades that this Cold War is going to last. Number 40, here's your differences. The U.S. and Soviet Union possessed different values. The United States had a democratic and free market economy. The Soviet Union had a totalitarian government and a communist economy. Communist economy for Soviet Union, free markets for the United States of America. That is our setup. Where's the strategies? Here's the strategy. It comes from Harry Truman, president who dropped the atomic bombs. It was called the Truman Doctrine, and the idea was, please write this in, containment of communism guided American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. So here's the idea of containment of communism. We are not going to fight any war to go into Soviet Union, to go into North Korea, but we will fight a war if communism looks to spread. If there's any spread, we're going to stop the spread of communism. Number 42, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also called NATO, NATO, formed as a defensive alliance. The U.S. and Western Europe. This is going to help with containment, not letting communism spread. The whole idea was to prevent a Soviet invasion, but stay on 42, baby. Stay on 42. Woo! The Soviets and the Allies formed the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet response to NATO. So we're worried about countries going communist. A big country goes communist. Communist takeover in China increased American fears of a worldwide communist takeover. However, China and the Soviet Union actually became rivals. President Nixon would exploit this split in the 1970s. They were rivals for territory and rivals for influence. But just understand that China has gone communist, and that increases fear of a worldwide communist takeover. Speaking of communism spreading, number 44, after communist North Korea invaded South Korea in the 1950s, the American military led a United Nations counterattack. Now, what is this? This reflects the policy of containment of communism. We are not letting communism spread into South Korea. It is absolutely unacceptable. So the war goes on. North Korea was aided by communist China, but between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War took place, and it eventually ended in a, please write this down, a stalemate. But South Korea was free of communist occupation. So in that way, containment was successful in Korea. Now, this is a crazy world you're living in, because now you have the threat of nuclear weapons. American schools held drills in case of nuclear attack. All the time across American schools, duck and cover drills took place in which American school children would get under their desks in the case of a nuclear attack. Citizens were urged to build bomb shelters in case of a nuclear attack. Now, there's lots of fear. Is there a reason for fear? Of course there is. How terrible a nuclear attack would be. Was there spies? Were there spies? Of course there were. Convictions of Alger Hiss, please write in Hiss, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for spying for the Soviet Union, especially the Rosenberg who gave up atomic secrets. What did this do? It increased domestic fears of communism. So you have a fear of communism on the rise. One individual decided to exploit this fear, and his name was Joseph McCarthy. Number 48. Senator Joseph McCarthy played on American fears by accusing U.S. officials and others of being communist. Did he have any evidence for this? No. What he was doing was called McCarthyism, making false accusations based off rumor or guilt by association. Eventually, McCarthy was discovered for the person that he was and was censored by the Senate and then died shortly thereafter. But he was popular for a period of time as he played off fears of American fears of communism. Last thing, how did Virginia do during the Cold War? Well, you know, actually, the heavy military spending benefited Virginia's economy? Let me give you 2 areas that benefited from this heavy military expenditures. Number 1 is the Hampton Roads area. Please write in Hampton Roads. This area is home to large naval and air bases, the Hampton Roads area. The other one is Northern Virginia, home to the Pentagon and companies which contract with the military, private defense contracting. Hampton Roads is down in Virginia Beach. Northern Virginia is where we are. Those are your 2 aspects of Virginia which benefited from the Cold War. And that is World War II to the Cold War.